We have finally disposed of, maybe that's the wrong word, dispensed with, gone past the age of the Stuarts. Oh, there'll be a couple that will try to make a sort of resurrection out of it, but by and large, they're done for. I never had any intention of ridiculing anybody in the portraits that I've done over the years of the figures. But the Hanovers seemed to get away from me. They were so inspirational that some of them were done for, but it was unintentional. We have to remember that this is the age of enormous and dynamic change, the 18th century. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution took place at this time. And of course, there's the ongoing war with France that began in the 1670s and wouldn't end until the early 19th century. Went on forever. England and France vying for power. And the power, of course, was colonial growth, enormous. England's colonial empire reached its zenith at this time. It went down in the 19th century. The American colonies, until they departed, were part of that growth. And the East India Company, encompassing a large part of India, islands in the Southeast Asia, parts of the Middle East, and parts of Africa, which would expand later, and of course Australia, when Cook made that part of the enterprise. And this meant huge trade, and that brought on a plague of merchants. And merchants occupied the House of Commons. When you go to England today, you see these grand country houses. These were not lords and princes and dukes. These were the merchants making vast fortunes, much of it in slavery, slave trade, as New York was the major slave center of the colonies. But it was a merchant-controlled government, so that would dictate a lot of what happened. And, of course, the royal family was German. When the Stuarts died out with Queen Anne in 1714, the Act of Succession, which had been agreed upon in 1702, settled the succession of the House of Stuart on the German House of Hanover. Now that all started with James I marrying his daughter Elizabeth to that particular house of Braunschweig-Lüneburg, and the descendants now, when our story takes up in 1714, descended on this German prince. He was one of the electors. Germany was not united. There were many duchies, principalities, and kingdoms at this time, and 7 and sometimes 11 of them were electors. They elected the Holy Roman Emperor, who was an Austrian, of course, the House of Habsburg for generations, and that's why we call them electors, but they held that position. Had all of the essential qualities. He was Protestant and anti-French. They didn't seem to care about anything else. Now, all these men in the Hanoverian line were weak, brave, obstinate, shy, quarrelsome, stingy, and stupid. So they have been perfect candidates for Congress today, but the man of the hour, Elector of Hanover, he'd been elector for about 6 years at the time. He was 54 when all of this starts with him in 1714. He was a bug-eyed, moody man. He was cautious about coming to England in the first place. You know, the English had a history of cutting their kings' heads off or throwing them out of power and so on. This made him nervous. He didn't really want to come over at all. But finally, he was prevailed upon to come to England, and he came down the gangplank with both heels skidding. He was not really enthusiastic about the whole thing. And of course, the English were dying to get a glimpse of this bird, because he was seen as a foreigner. He was a foreigner. English have a very sensible attitude, like the French. They loathe foreigners. So they wanted to see him, and here came George with his German court, and they were waiting for the Queen to descend with him. Where was the Queen? Well, he had a wife, yes, surely. Years and years and years ago, he had married Sophia Dorothea von Sell. It was an arranged marriage. Most of these that I'm going to talk about are arranged marriages. She was a vibrant, active, party-loving, attractive young woman when they married. And George was sort of muddy and moody and grumpy and not terribly interested in anything except his mistresses, apparently. Sophia managed to produce 2 children. Well, that was the purpose of the marriage. George didn't show much interest in her, and as the years passed, she began to find other entertainment. She took a lover. Handsome Philip von Königsmarck was a man about the court in Herrenchiemsee. He found the Electress, Sophia, very attractive. She found him equally so. And they began a relationship, and pretty soon they decided, after some months, maybe a year or so, oh, to hell with it, let's skip town. Let's elope. We'll go to Paris and live like gypsies. Of course, you couldn't get a divorce. They just had to leave the country. So they planned this out, that they would do just that. They would leave Hanover and go and live in Paris. Well, the date was set for the elopement. And as Königsmarck was creeping up the stairs in the dark at midnight to carry off the Electress, he was set upon by thugs. They attacked him and beat him and broke his arm and hit him in the head and knocked him down, and onto the floor he fell, bleeding and nearly unconscious. At that point, from the shadows out stepped the Countess von Platen. She went over to him, laying on the floor there. She looked down, said, "You are never going to bring scandal on this house," and drove her heel into his mouth, breaking his teeth. Well, Königsmarck disappeared. He was carried off, and we don't know what happened to him. George, the Elector, Sophia's husband, had been in Berlin, conveniently. He returned the next day, didn't say anything about it to her, simply ordered his wife arrested. And she was carried off to a country estate, a castle. And there she remained under house arrest the rest of her life. She never saw her children again. So that added a little charm to George's arrival in England. There's a little story for us. Well, he did bring with him his mistresses, however. Erengard von der Schullerberg came down the gangplank. He later styled her the Duchess of Kendal. She was tall and skinny and rattled and older than George, and so the English called her the Maypole. And behind her came Sophie von Kilmanzig von Platen. And this charming damoiselle was later styled the Countess of Darlington. And she was quite plump, as you can see. So the English called her the Elephant. Kendal, in blue over there, looking through the quizzing glass. The Duchess of Kendal was the very model of a bad royal mistress. She spoke some English, but not much. Now, George didn't speak any English. He spoke French and Latin and German. And of course, the British ministers and all the people he had to deal with spoke maybe a little French and some Latin, but they didn't speak any German, so it was difficult. Kendal became the gatekeeper to the king. Nobody could get through to him without going through her first, for a small consideration. And she would translate. The ministers came and told her what she had to say to the king, and she would say it to the king, or what she wanted him to hear. And this is the way it went. And she made herself rich doing this. Robert Walpole was a member of the cabinet at this time. She said, "Kendal is little better than an idiot." Well, maybe an idiot, but a rich one. The Countess of Darlington was rather charming. Remember her well. Yes, she liked good times. She was not a deep person, no intellectual, but she enjoyed having musicians and nice music and maybe some actors and doing things that are pleasant around her. She held a little court there at Kensington Palace and was a nice person, generally speaking, and more gracious, let's say, than some of the others. Well, this was the age of government by cabinet. Queen Anne had started it by sort of stepping out of the picture, and the cabinet dominated George I's reign. He was only too happy to let them do so because he didn't want any trouble. So he was a hands-off king. And Robert Walpole became his primary minister. And becoming the primary minister meant that he became what we call today the prime minister. And we have had prime ministers ever since. He was the first one so styled, and the title has remained. And of course, the prime minister is the virtual ruler of the government. One thing that the Hanovers brought with them was a lusty tradition of detesting their firstborn sons. And this has another tradition that has lasted down to the present day, because as you know, Queen Elizabeth II has had nothing but difficulty with her sons. It's a comforting tradition. George I hated England. He never did like to be there. He always looked forward to summers when he would go back to Herrenhausen in Hanover. He spent nearly 3 months there every year. And so he always anticipated the summer trip. Sometime in 1726, his health began to fail. He began to go downhill in a hurry. And he was very concerned that the next summer he would be in Germany. He had a premonition, apparently, that the end was near. Early in 27, the next year, he had a small stroke. And of course, as we know, that sometimes precurses another, and he had a series. And it was time for the trip. He went a little early. They rushed him across the channel and hurtled him into Germany with the coaches, relayed coaches, so that he would be there, which everybody realized was happening. He had a massive stroke, and as they entered the grounds of Herrenhausen, he died. So at least he was able to die where he loved to be. The Duchess of Kendal, interestingly enough, did not want to go back to Germany. She purchased an estate in Twickenham, and there she remained. She's something of a character because, well, she was a relict of the time, George I, and people would come to visit her, and she seemed to live forever. One day, as she was seated at her dressing table, a large raven flew in the window and perched on the mirror in front of her and went, "Bark!" Oh, she says, "Ach, du Himmelgott, auf sehen Sie, auf senden. It's George resurrected." And she fed the bird, kept it around, and pretty soon had a beautiful cage made for it, kept the bird. And then, of course, visitors did want to come see this bird. And they would come, and they all had to remove their hats and bow and curtsy and say, "Your Majesty," in front of the raven. Well, this went on until the old Duchess died, which seemed like forever later, in 1743. And on the day of her death, the raven broke out of its cage and flew out the window, never to be seen again. Well, the Prince of Wales now becomes George II. Another bug-eyed, morose, bellicose, red-faced man. Well, he was more red-faced and loud-mouthed than his father had been, I must say. George II was maybe not our ideal of a pleasant dinner companion, but nevertheless. He was born and raised in Germany, so he spoke English with a very heavy accent. To his credit, or not to his credit, to his father's credit, he inherited a strong government and a kingdom at peace, and therefore a prosperous kingdom. England was enjoying several decades now of prosperity. Walpole was at the height of his career as first minister, and this age of prime ministers, as I say, would continue. George was not terribly comfortable with Walpole. Men like George are never comfortable with intelligent others. And and George was a natural Tory, but Walpole was a Whig and head of the Whig Party. Not that they were liberals and progressives as we think of them today, but in that day and age they were. George's saving grace, however, was his wife. He had married in his late teens Caroline von Brunswick, and this was in Germany before they ever came to England, and they had raised their family there and then finished it off in England. She was his intellectual superior by 10, no question of a doubt. She was more thoughtful than her husband, obviously, And she saw the utility of Walpole. So every time George began to grumble about being uncomfortable with Walpole's ideas, she said, well, now listen, he's making us rich. And he was. He was making the royal family hugely wealthy with his policies. So George shut up and Walpole stayed. Both the king and the queen were, I would imagine in today's ideas, coarse, foul-mouthed, and vulgar. They enjoyed an extraordinarily rich sexual life. They were passionate in their couplings, and you could hear it out in the hallway, the grunts, the groans, the screams of delight, and the thrashing of the bedboards and the rest of it. And everybody knew that they were getting along just beautifully. But George did philander, no question about that. He philandered, and the queen was very concerned that she never lose her hold over him. I suppose this is not an unusual circumstance. And so she always tried to meet him on his own ground. And he was a physical man. He enjoyed sport and outside riding and all this sort of thing. One of the things they got into the habit of doing was a post-tea walk, whatever the weather, winter, summer, whatever. So sometime before, after 3:30, before in that area, the king would come and throw open the door and collect his wife, and off they'd go. Well, in her 30s, she began to develop arthritic problems. And because her feet pained her, especially in the winter. And so she didn't want George to think that she was ill or incapacitated or weak or feeble or any of this, because she felt that this would turn him off, as we say. So on those winter days, when they were going off on their walk, she would have her maids bring in about 20 minutes or 30 minutes ahead of the walk time. And George was very punctual. He always arrived on time. He had to be ready. Buckets of ice water and ice. And she would plunge her feet into the ice water over and over and over until she couldn't feel anything. Then the maids would dry her feet, put on the wool stockings, lace up the boots, the door would fly open, mein Schatzen, come. So off they hustled, and of course for the first 20 minutes her feet were fine, and she would stump around with her husband. They both shared something else, and that was a mutual and absolutely volcanic loathing of their eldest son, Frederick, the Prince of Wales. Damn him, I wish he were in hell, said his mother. He should be hanged, said the king. Oh, they really loathed this man. Well, Frederick was a bit of an ass. He was difficult. And I don't know they earned that enmity, but they really detested him. Well, unfortunately for George, and I think for England, Caroline, in the late 30s, 1730s, developed a cancer of the womb. She had had a prolapse, and it was one of those things they couldn't treat then, and of course it proved fatal. And when she lay dying, George was simply outraged. He couldn't believe it. How could you leave me? What are you doing? You know, and he would bang on the bed and kick the bed frame and pound the bed sheets. And poor Caroline there in her extremis said, yes, George, but you must marry again. I'll never marry. You're the only woman in my life. Oh, I may take mistresses, he said. And what a comfort, she said. Well, when Caroline died, then George's true political nature was free to flower. And this brought forth a cactus, of course. All of his reactionary attitudes were able to focus on Walpole, and the king's undermining, the monarch, even though constitutional and not controlling the government, had, always does, has enormous influence, and still could if she wished to do, by undermining Walpole to his associates, and this was reflected in Parliament. The Whigs were voted out of power and the Tories came in. Well, this is what George wanted. So Walpole falls. And so with Walpole, the peace. Because in a couple of years, England was again at war. And this is called the War of the Austrian Succession. Now, the agents concerning us were the French and the English, but the war was between Prussia and Austria. However, England allied herself to Austria to fight Prussia and France. Well, the war went on for a couple of years. It wasn't a long war. And these countries, England and France, fought part of their war in their colonies. And in North America, it was called King George's War. Interesting for our little story, the king himself, George II, being a German, and his native land was Hanover. And when Hanover was threatened, he went in, he led the English troops, and he went into Germany, and he led charges against the enemy. He actually in the field, horse and sword, waving his hat and all red-faced and screaming epithets at everybody, he led the charge at Dettingen. Now, he became the last reigning monarch in English history, and I don't know of any other monarch anywhere else, who actually went into battle. So, as I say, none of these people were cowards. They were all very courageous. Of course, courage doesn't always go with intelligence, does it? As we've seen. The French were greatly annoyed at the fact that English were meddling in their war against Austria. And so they mounted an effort to reestablish the Stuarts in Scotland and in England. And this devolved upon the grandson of James II. He'd been deposed in the Glorious Revolution. And his son, the French had sponsored a rebellion to get him back on the throne in 1715, I guess it was, 1415, just after the Hanovers came to power. Well, that was squelched. That didn't go anywhere. But now in 45, they tried it again with Charles Edward Stuart. Charles Edward was, I think, 20-something. He was very pretty and very dumb and perfect leader of men. He was at the head of a French expeditionary force which sort of fell apart before they reached Scotland. It takes some doing getting from Dover. But anyway, they finally landed in Scotland, and the lairds who finally met him, all right, fine, he was accepted as the chosen leader in the revival of the Stuart kingdom. And by the time he reached central Scotland, he had quite a gathering, and pretty soon all the lairds began to gather around the clans and all the rest. What they wanted was a fight. So they mounted their effort, and they invaded England. A huge mass of Scots. And they drove down the west coast. And they made it nearly to Oxford. For God's sake. On a good clear day, you could see them from London. Panic in the streets. Well, by that time, the Scots were so badly disorganized. They were worrying about their supply lines, and they were fighting over the leadership, and Prince Charles was hardly a man who could bring everybody together under one sword. And so they decided they should retreat while they were still able to. And they began to retreat. Well, of course, London wasn't sitting around with their eyes closed. The king's government had ordered the Duke of Cumberland, this was the king's brother, to march north directly and encounter the Scots as they were reaching their own borders and then deal with them. And they did. There were several battles culminating in the Battle of Culloden, which was an absolute massacre of the Scots. And of course, the Duke of Cumberland was always known as Butcher Cumberland after that. The Scots were then deprived of their use of their tartans or their clans, and all the rest of it was dismantled, and the Scots from that day to this have hated the English even more. So it's one of those great historical epics of human intelligence at work. George went on hating his son mightily. And Prince Frederick, Prince of Wales, never did anything ever to please his father, except in 1751, when he died. He died of something like flu or pneumonia. It was hard to tell from this vantage point, but carried him off. And George was greatly relieved to have rid of him. George lived on for another nearly decade. But then in 1760, he himself, at the age of 77, died. And before his death, he had ordered that when he died, his casket would have the side knocked out, and Caroline's casket, long in the tomb, would be similarly treated so that the sides would be open and they would be pushed together and united in death as they had been in life. Oh, that's touching. Well, George didn't have a son to inherit. He had a grandson. He had 2 or 3 grandsons at this time. And his grandson, George, everybody's named that, you know, was now George III. He was 20 years old. His mother, the Dowager Princess of Wales, Augusta, was a termagant. She had been controlling her sons ever since they were born. She'd been a terrible offense to King George II, by the way. He'd had a terrible time with his daughter-in-law. But she was now in control. And she dominated young George III. He was maybe socially backward. He wasn't very slick as a young fellow. Energetic and, you know, the usual things. In fact, he was extending his sweaty hand toward his first mistress when his mother stepped in and virtually slapped it and said, "Now, George, be a king. You've got to get married." And then she arranged a marriage for him. She chose her favorite niece, Charlotte Sophia von Mecklenburg-Strelitz. And, of course, the 2 youngsters had never seen each other. I don't know, maybe George has seen his cousin once. I don't think so. But it was arranged, and a proxy marriage when they were still apart in the countries, and then they were joined in England in a formal marriage again. Carlotta Sophia, or Charlotte Sophia, was small, not particularly plump or anything, but not particularly pretty either. She had a frog-like appearance. Well, I didn't think she was so homely, but many people felt she was a plain soul, if you will. Well, he was no Prince Charming, so come on. Now, both of them were devoted to duty, absolutely devoted to duty, and as a result, they produced 15 children. It was hard to find Charlotte Sophia there when she wasn't pregnant, but we had a 6-week period where we caught her before he did. And they were people of simple tastes. They maintained their palace at Kensington and Windsor, their favorite residences. They enjoyed simple food. They weren't particularly exotic in their tastes at all. George was musical. In fact, all of these people were musical to some degree. George played instruments, violin and clavichord, and he sang. They all sang. Of course, Handel had been a great favorite at court for a generation. Others, too. He was artistic. He painted, did credible painting. He read history omnivorously, and he was a cartographer. He was a man of education. He was not a dunce, as so many people want to make him out, not at all. But he was very determined and rather narrow-minded in some ways. His court was dowdy, and that's all we can say about it. As his sons, he had all his children, you see, and 7 of them were boys. So as the boys came along and were old enough, he put them to work in Kew Gardens, which was adjacent to the palace there. Had it all set out. It was a great walled, it's a park now, but it was all walled off and made into vegetable patches. And then he made the boys go out and work the patches, hoeing and weeding and doing whatever you do in the garden. And of course they hated it. Oh, they were so resentful. And people would crawl up on the wall, look at the princes sweating away in the sun and make fun, Oh, God, can you imagine? They really resented their father for Farmer George, the public would call the king. Yeah. Well, he would get up at 5, light his own fire, make his own tea. His equerries and all came in finally and, got him dressed. But he was up and around in early hours. The country remained reasonably peaceful until the mid-50s, when the war started up again. This was the Anglo-French War, although, of course, it was, again, not on the continent looked like that. It was called the 7 Years' War, so you know how long it lasted. England now allied herself with Prussia, which was more comforting to the monarchy because they were all German, of German extraction. And France and Austria allied against England and Prussia. So it became a world war. The Swedes, the Italians, the Spanish, everybody got into this damn thing. And again, in the colonies. And what did we call it in the colonies? Yes, because both sides used the Indians to attack the others. And the Indians were only too happy to do all this and turn on their allies too. It was lovely. Men love this sort of thing. So everybody was happy, except the women. By 63, when it petered out, everybody lost their energy, and the Peace of Paris was struck. This was not a peace, it was a truce. It would rise up again, but they had a quiet moment. And this was the moment for everybody to restore the exchequer. You know, both countries had depleted themselves fighting this idiotic war. Gee, that's beginning to sound somehow familiar. Well, anyway, and His Majesty's government decided that the colonies should pay more toward the Crown's expenditures, or the government's expenditures. Now, the interesting thing about the colonies, there were now 13, there had been 14. Each colony had its own assembly, which it elected, voted into office and elected, and most of them had their own elected governors, and they were rich, and they taxed themselves. The tax money was spent in the colonies on the colonists, and some of it went back to the Crown. They were Crown colonies. The Crown made some money off that, always, but now they wanted to make more. The colonies produced wealth for the shareholders of the corporations who ran the colonies, or whose colonies they were. So that's the way that worked. Now the thing is that in the 1760s, the Crown, under Grenville, Rockingham, and North, these were succeeding prime ministers, began to tax the colonists directly. I hope you see the significance of this. They went right over the local colonial assemblies and taxed the colonists directly. And this is what aggravated the colonists, nothing else. And this is what brought on the guerrilla war, which ruined the whole thing for England. Finally, because it was so unpopular, at first, the king was all for this. This was his government. And Parliament, well, both houses, at least the House of Commons, favored it. And the British public were not out of it until they realized they were going over the drink to fight Uncle Fred and Aunt Susie. So they weren't going to participate. And the British simply would not. There was no draft of Englishmen to go to the war, but they were press ganged into the army. And they began to avoid it. Well, of course, they had to have troops. So the king went to his wife's relatives, the Duke of Hesse, and hired his army, which was fine. They were all for hire. So the Hessians came to fight the war. And interestingly enough, in 1776, the biggest land invasion ever mounted in this period of history was launched against the British colonies by Britain. Fleet after fleet, army after army sent in. And didn't they do well? And let that be a lesson to us. Well, of course, the whole thing turned very unpopular. The king had rocks thrown at him in public. Governments came and went, and the whole thing disintegrated. It was a huge disaster. Everybody was very disillusioned with it. And the king never gave up on the idea that the colonies had been out of line and that he'd done the right thing. But it all ended, and finally, in desperation, they recognized the independence of the United States in 1783. This is years after the fighting stopped. And it broke the king's heart. It wasn't long after that the so-called curse of the Hanovers made itself evident. And this was porphyria. Not erythropoietic protoporphyria, but porphyria. It's a systemic blood serum disorder. And it manifests itself in ways that are similar to what we think of commonly as madness: incoherence, incontinence, violence, logorrhea, can't stop talking. And but you get paid for it in some circles. and the such. And it came and went in his life. It started out mild, got a little worse, then he'd have a period that was good, and then it'd go back and forth. By the end of the 80s, 1780s, the king's influence, and he'd been a very powerful figure in British government, a Johnsonian, if you will. I mean, what was his name? President Johnson, that kind of Johnsonian power, and it's all gone now by the end of the 80s. He was out of touch. He didn't seem to know what was going on. He was talking to the curtains and such. He had violent sprees. There was one occasion I remember vividly. We all saw this. They were at Windsor. The family was there. A good many of the children were there. And he had difficulty that he and the Prince of Wales did not get along. Did I have to tell you that? They didn't get along. And as dinner was concluding, there were some words. I don't remember what the words were, but the king lunged at the Prince of Wales, knocked him out of his chair, threw him on the floor, and tried to kill him. Well, of course, the equerries and footmen dragged them apart, and the prince was saved. But the king had moments that are very violent. So, by 1802, he had been in and out of. He'd been under treatment. They took him into, the treatment was perfectly hideous, but he'd been in a private arrangement, being treated, and he seemed to recover. The public saw him as an ill man put upon by disrespectful sons, so obviously they felt sorry for him. And his popularity was growing. And when he seemed to recover, and this was a great surprise because they were talking about a regency and all that sort of thing in the House of Lords. And suddenly he seemed to have been recovered. And he ordered a celebration, and it took place at St. Paul's, and there he was with the Prince of Wales and the other sons, and the daughters and the Queen and everybody, huzzawing and waving his hat, and he looked, my God, he's all right. Well, it didn't last long, the great recovery, because by 1811, he had subsided into complete oblivion. He was last seen in Windsor, which they did arrange for him. They padded the walls of his apartment. He was confined to a single area. He was so violent now that his equerries couldn't shave him, and he'd gone blind with cataract. So he was out of it, but he would play on the clavier and sing at the top of his lungs, this blind old man. It wasn't, however, until 10 years later, in 1820, at the age of 82, that his tormented spirit winged its way to eternal freedom. Now, during this period, 1820, he had missed the flush of the industrialization of England getting underway, more industrialized than any other country. The French Revolution had come and gone. He didn't know anything about that. Napoleon had risen, created mayhem all over the world and fallen. He was out of the picture. George didn't know anything about that. The colonial boom, he was oblivious to it all. There, singing hymns in Windsor. Now, George III has been underestimated, I think, by many historians. He was a man of some parts. He was completely devoted to what he thought was his duty to preserve his monarchy and pass it on intact to his children. He thought he was doing the right thing under the Constitution. It's an unwritten Constitution, but he thought he was doing the right thing. He believed sincerely. He was never a monster, nor was he a madman. Well, what is going to happen next? After the intermission, we'll find out.